Carlo Ancelotti has coached some of the finest midfielders the sport has ever produced. Pirlo, Seedorf, Kaká, Modric, Kroos, Casemiro. So when a manager carrying that kind of history spends only a handful of days around a young midfielder and instantly senses something unusual, it's probably worth paying attention. In June 2025, Ancelotti had barely settled into the Brazil job. He was getting ready for his first fixture as national team manager, and standing among the players in front of him was a 21-year-old named Andrey Santos. Ancelotti hardly knew him. He said as much himself. Yet, after just a few training sessions, he was already confident enough to sum Santos up in two words that carry far more weight now than they seemed to at the time. Complete midfielder. At that moment, it was easy to let the comment slide. Santos was still a Chelsea player, fresh off a strong loan season in France. Talented, obviously, but also just another young Brazilian midfielder trying to break into a squad stacked with familiar names. And Ancelotti compliments players constantly, so the remark passed without much attention. More than a year on, Andrey Santos is a Manchester United player. He has turned into one of the defining storylines of their pre-season, and suddenly those two words sound completely different. Because the longer you watch him, the harder he is to define. Some have labeled him box-to-box. Others have seen a natural 8. Plenty have looked at his defensive work and wondered whether his home is deeper. For years, everyone had a slightly different theory about what Andrey Santos actually is. Everyone except, perhaps, Carlo Ancelotti. Maybe one of the most decorated coaches in football had already worked it out, and we simply hadn't caught up. Now Santos himself has handed us the clearest clue yet. Throughout his European career, one question has never had a tidy answer. What exactly is he? Chelsea moved him around different midfield roles. At Strasbourg, he could begin deep and still somehow turn up inside the opposition box. Even when Manchester United completed the signing, Jason Wilcox described him as a box-to-box midfielder. And Santos never seemed in any rush to correct anybody. When Chelsea asked about his position in November 2025, his reply was almost deliberately open-ended. He explained that he was raised as a number 6 but felt fine as an 8 as well, and wherever the coach wanted him, that's where he'd play. It was exactly the sort of answer you'd expect from a young player chasing minutes in a squad where Moises Caicedo already occupied the role he knew best. Something has shifted since then. On August 8th, Manchester United met Paris Saint-Germain in the 4th friendly of their summer. Santos started once more, as he had in all 3 previous matches. And by the end of another convincing display, one of the biggest questions attached to his arrival was becoming impossible to avoid. Afterwards, Santos was asked what he thought he could offer this Manchester United side. This time, there was no diplomatic line about doing whatever the manager asked. He was direct. He said he likes and prefers playing deeper as a number 6. That may sound minor. It isn't. For the first time since arriving in England, Santos wasn't merely saying he was capable of playing there. He was saying that's where he wants to be. His reasoning made it more interesting still. Santos said he wants to help teammates with and without the ball, but that when possession reaches him, his instinct is to break lines. That reveals a lot about how he interprets the job. He doesn't see the 6 as a player who shields the defense, wins the ball back, and passes it to somebody more creative. He wants to be the one launching attacks too. Then the conversation turned to the Man United are trying to replace Casemiro. For Santos, this was never just another midfielder. He grew up watching him with Brazil, watched him win everything at Real Madrid, then watched him become one of the senior voices at Old Trafford. Santos called him a legend, but when he was asked whether he could shoulder the responsibility Casemiro left behind, he didn't hide behind the compliment. He said that with Casemiro gone and himself now here, he feels he can do what Casemiro did last season. For a 22-year-old only weeks into the club, that was a bold statement. He wasn't asking for a season of quiet learning behind somebody else. He wasn't asking for time to figure out his position. He was looking at one of the heaviest jobs in Manchester United's midfield and saying he believed he could carry it. That confidence makes more sense when you consider where he's come from. At Chelsea, somebody was always in front of him. There were loans, changing roles, changing managers, and a midfield built around players who had already arrived. At United, the picture is different. There's a gap, there's responsibility available, and Santos clearly thinks that gap sits deeper in midfield. The curious part is that he's been hinting at this for years. He said he grew up as a 6. He's talked before about being comfortable deeper, but there was always a sentence attached afterwards. I can play 8 too. I can play wherever the coach needs me. This time, that sentence never. This time, Andrey Santos chose his position, and the way we've been reading him may need rethinking entirely, because if he really is a 6, there's an obvious complication. Number 6s aren't supposed to produce some of the things Andrey Santos has produced, and once you examine those numbers, the confusion deepens. If Santos genuinely sees himself as a 6, his Strasbourg season becomes very hard to explain. A 6 is normally measured by how well he screens the midfield, how frequently he regains possession, how calmly he keeps the ball circulating, and how much freedom he grants the players ahead of him. Santos was doing all of that. He was also scoring 10 league goals, and that's where it stops adding up. At 20 years old, he was arriving around the penalty area like an attacking 8. Yet his work without the ball told a different story completely. He made 110 tackles in Ligue 1 that season, more than anyone else in the division, recovered possession 188 times, and among players contesting at least 250 duels, nobody topped his 66.7% success rate. So the same midfielder repeatedly popping up in dangerous areas at one end was also one of the toughest players in France to get past at the other. Watch only the goals and you'd push him higher. Watch only the tackles, recoveries, and duels and you'd call him a defensive midfielder. Neither version captured the whole thing. You might have expected the Premier League to bring clarity when he returned. Instead, the numbers grew stranger. His attacking brief at Chelsea was different, but another element of his game emerged: his security in possession. Santos completed just over 90% of his passes while still looking forward regularly, averaging more than 14 forward passes per 90. Even more striking, he was dispossessed only 0.1 times per 90. For a central midfielder in a league where you're pressed almost the instant you receive it, that's absurd. And the aggression hadn't gone anywhere. Among Premier League midfielders with at least 1,000 minutes, Santos won 67.8% of his ground duels, the highest rate in the competition, alongside a 74% tackle success rate. The player who scored 10 times in France was now barely conceding possession in England while still posting elite defensive figures. Then came the Tottenham match in May 2026, where nearly every contradictory piece of his profile appeared inside the same 90 minutes. Santos scored, won a game-high 5 tackles, won 6 of his 8 duels, and completed all 38 of his passes. Not 38 out of 40, all 38. Since detailed Premier League passing data began, only one other Chelsea midfielder had played a full match, attempted at least 30 passes, and completed every one: Moises Caicedo. That performance felt like a summary of the entire player. Arriving to score like an 8, competing like a 6, controlling the ball like the man you build the first phase around. It's why labeling him has always been awkward. Most midfielders eventually announce what they are, because their strengths drag them naturally towards one role. With Santos, every strength drags him somewhere different. Liam Roseneur noticed it at Strasbourg, joking that Santos played like a 32-year-old, because while everybody saw the goals, his duel numbers were just as striking. Perhaps arguing over whether he's a 6 or an 8 was always the wrong debate. The genuinely interesting thing isn't that he can do both jobs. It's how naturally both live inside the same player. In modern football, that's among the rarest things to find. For a long time, midfielders were simple to categorize. The defensive midfielder stayed behind the ball, shielded the center backs, and won possession. The 8 carried the ball forward, linked midfield to attack, and arrived in the box. Then there was the creator. Modern football has been dismantling those categories. The best sides no longer just want someone excellent at one job. They want players who let them change a game without changing the team. Declan Rice is the clearest illustration. At West Ham, he was known as the midfielder protecting the defense and driving the ball out of pressure. At Arsenal, the same player has operated deeper, higher, beside another 6, and at times almost as an attacking 8. One week, he's the man snuffing out counterattacks. The next, he's arriving near the box creating chances. Bruno Guimaraes has lived something similar. For years at Newcastle, he was often the deepest midfielder because the team needed that. He took the ball from the center backs, helped Newcastle escape pressure, and drove the build-up. Once Sandro Tonali settled alongside him, Bruno could push higher. The player never changed. The responsibility did. That flexibility is enormously valuable because it hands managers options inside a single match. A midfielder can start as the deepest player while his side builds, move higher when a teammate drops beside the defense, then become the first presser the moment possession is lost. It's why asking whether somebody is a 6 or an 8 matters less than it used to. Andrey Santos has been growing into that mold for years. People around Vasco spotted it long before Europe. Juninho Pernambucano watched him emerge as a teenager and described him as unusually complete for his age. Santos could take the ball near his own defense without being uncomfortable when the game pulled him forward. That kept developing. He learned how to build from underneath the ball, how to break up opposition attacks, how to survive physical duels, and how to recognize the moments to abandon the deeper position and attack space. Individually, none of those traits are rare. Finding them in one body is. There are defensive midfielders who tackle more, attacking midfielders who score more, deep playmakers who pass more elegantly, but when a single player offers pieces of all 3, the entire midfield becomes simpler to construct. That's the appeal. A manager doesn't need to remove Santos to reshape his midfield. He can change what Santos is asked to do. Keep him deep, and he helps control possession. Release him, and he moves forward. Lose the ball, and he has the aggression to fight for it immediately. That's why players like Rice and Guimaraes have become so important to elite teams. Their value isn't that nobody knows their position. It's that their game holds up when the position changes. Santos seems aware his development has been heading this way. Earlier this year, discussing how his game had evolved, he described himself as a more complete player than the one who first landed in Europe. That word keeps circling him. Complete. Juninho used it when Santos was a teenager. Ancelotti used almost identical language with Brazil. Now, at 22, Santos is starting to resemble the kind of midfielder clubs spend fortunes hunting. Someone who removes the choice between physicality and technique, between defending and progressing the ball, or even between a 6 and an 8. But those qualities only matter if a coach knows how to arrange them. Michael Carrick appears to have decided remarkably fast. Carrick didn't ease Santos in. Days after the move from Chelsea was finalized, Santos was starting United's opening preseason fixture against Wrexham. It wasn't the debut he'd have pictured. United lost 1-0. Santos played only the first half, and the team was still hunting for rhythm. Individually, though, the reasoning behind his selection was already visible. He completed 93% of his passes and created 2 chances, looking oddly settled for a player who had barely trained with his new teammates. Carrick called it a promising beginning. 6 days later against Rosenborg, those signs became far more obvious. United were much better, winning 5-0, and Santos looked less like a newcomer learning the team and more like somebody already accepting responsibility within it. His passing was crisper, he kept locating forward options, and his positioning gave United a dependable route through the middle. Afterwards, Carrick didn't single out one spectacular moment. He praised Santos's intelligence, positioning, creativity, and ability to link the side together. Mason Mount felt the difference too, explaining that with Santos operating beneath him, he had more license to push forward. That was the first real sign that Santos wasn't only executing his own role well, his presence was altering what teammates could do. But Rosenborg was still Rosenborg. The real examination came against Atlético Madrid. United were behind inside 5 minutes, and Santos was no longer floating through a friendly his team controlled. Atlético were aggressive, physical, and far more likely to punish sloppiness in midfield. This was the type of match where a young player can vanish. Santos did the opposite. Across 82 minutes he had 90 touches, more than anyone on the pitch, and completed 75 of 81 passes. He won every duel he entered, made 3 tackles and 3 interceptions, blocked a shot, and still delivered 7 passes into the final third. The statistics tell part of it, but watching told you more. United kept returning to him. When they needed the match slowed, Santos was available. When they needed to play through Atletico's press, he kept showing for it. When possession went, he was still competing for second balls and shutting down space. United recovered to win 2-1, and for the first time that summer Santos had produced that level against opposition genuinely capable of exposing him. Then Paris Saint-Germain, another climb in difficulty. United conceded inside 2 minutes, and before the game had even settled, Mason Mount limped off injured. Whatever structure Carrick had planned collapsed instantly. Santos had to adapt. Midway through the first half came a moment that won't feature on any highlight package but explains plenty about the responsibility he'd been handed. PSG broke through again, and Ibrahim Mbaye looked set to shoot. Santos tracked back across the pitch and flung himself into a sliding block. United stayed alive, eventually drawing 1-1, and Santos was among those praised afterwards once more. A pattern was forming. Not simply that he'd started all 4 friendlies, but the escalating nature of the tests. Wrexham was about settling. Rosenborg was about linking the team. Atletico was about withstanding pressure and winning a much harder midfield battle. PSG was about adjusting when everything went wrong immediately. Santos answered each one differently. That's what makes his preseason more compelling than simply saying he's played well. Carrick has raised the level of responsibility almost weekly, and Santos has given him almost no reason to pull it back. There are still fixtures before the season starts, and preseason only reveals so much. But 4 matches into his United career, Santos no longer looks like a £50 million midfielder Carrick is still assessing. He looks like one Carrick already trusts. Perhaps that's the most revealing detail of all, because Carrick needed 4 games to see it. Carlo Ancelotti needed a few days. The odd thing about Ancelotti's remark is how little he knew Santos when he made it. Appointed by Brazil in May 2025, Ancelotti was preparing for his first international window. Santos had earned a place in that opening squad off the back of his Strasbourg season, but he remained one of the less established names in a midfield containing Casemiro, Bruno Guimaraes, and Gerson. Brazil gathered for camp. Ancelotti watched Santos train for a matter of days, and before the opening match against Ecuador, he was asked about the midfielders at his disposal. When Santos's name arose, Ancelotti admitted he hadn't known him well beforehand, but what he'd witnessed in training had already left a mark. He said Andrey had plenty of quality, and that from what he'd seen over those few days, he struck him as a complete midfielder. At the time, it was easy to nod and move on. Managers praise young players constantly, especially ones they've just selected, and Santos was still only 21, trying to establish himself among far more experienced names. But Ancelotti's decisions gave the words weight. The following night, in his first game in charge, he brought Santos on against Ecuador. Santos was selected again in the next window, and by September he was starting a World Cup qualifier against Bolivia. This wasn't politeness towards a promising youngster. It was a first impression that rapidly became trust. Even after injury disrupted his momentum, Ancelotti brought him back into the Brazil picture again in 2026, which makes that original description feel far more significant now. Ancelotti never claimed Santos was already world-class, and never promised he'd become an automatic starter. What he identified was more specific. He saw a midfielder whose game couldn't be reduced to a single job. That's followed Santos everywhere. Different coaches have deployed him differently, because different parts of his game keep giving them reasons to. One trusts him deeper, another pushes him higher, another asks for more out of possession. That doesn't mean nobody knows what to do with him. It might mean the reverse. It might mean Santos offers managers more than one right answer. Then, in March 2026, Santos gave an interview to FIFA and reached for almost identical language himself, saying he'd become a more complete player. Less than a year after Ancelotti applied that word to him, Santos was using it about his own growth. Suddenly, the whole debate around his position looks different. For years, people hunted for the single label that explained him. 6, 8, box-to-box, ball winner, controller. Ancelotti never seemed interested in picking one. He'd spent years working with Pirlo, Modric, Kroos, and Casemiro, players with wildly different qualities and wildly different jobs. So when he looked at Santos, he didn't describe a position. He described a player, a complete midfielder. More than a year later, with Santos opening a new chapter at Manchester United, those words no longer sound like routine praise. They sound like the simplest explanation anyone has offered. Carlo Ancelotti warned us about Andrey Santos. We just weren't listening properly yet.